Good evening, everyone. The doors are starting to close, so you know that the event is drawing near. So my name is John Shaw. I'm the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. Thank you all for coming out for what I'm sure will be a terrific conversation with a local woman who has come back home, Jen Daulby. And Jen has had an amazing career, grew up in Southern Illinois, went to SIU Law School, has done some amazing things that we'll talk about in just a minute. But I want to have a confession to make. I usually, the Institute is very, very strategic in how we get our guests and, read foreign policy magazines and podcasts and blogs and just are extremely strategic and thoughtful about, securing our speakers. So about a year ago, I was in Washington, D.C., staying at a hotel in D.C. on Capitol Hill, and I was walking to breakfast, and I had a baseball cap on and a Paul Simon Public Policy Institute sweatshirt. And I'd sort of thrown it on. I wasn't even really quite remembering what I was wearing. And I passed someone in the street, and she said, "Go SIU." And I turned and I said, hi, and so we started chatting a little bit. And she said, "Oh yeah, I grew up in Des Moines, and I went to SIU Law School, and she said, I've actually been, I knew several of your predecessors and, have had some dealings with the Institute and have great things to say about it." So we exchanged cards and I said, "Okay, I'm gonna get you back to Southern Illinois." She said, "Well, let's figure it out." So I reached out just a couple, as soon as I got back to my hotel room, I Googled her and said, "Okay, yeah, I do want to get her back to SIU." So we exchanged emails and then over the course of several months put this together. So the structure is Jen and I will talk for a little bit about her career. She is, I didn't mean to bury the lead, she is the CEO of a really important group called the Congressional Management Foundation, which provides very valuable services for training members of Congress how to build offices and create offices and work with constituents and reach out and make Congress an effective institute, or as effective as no cheap shots on Congress. It's too easy of a target, but trying to build the institution of Congress, which is really an important one. And even when it's not legislating, it's providing important constituent services that we'll talk about. So let me go over and join Jen. We're going to talk for a little bit, and then we're going to open it up for questions and look forward to a really good discussion. So thanks so much. Jen, thank you and I should say Jen has been an absolute trooper today. She came and spoke with students at the Institute over lunch, and then she had 2 meetings at the law school from 2 to 3 and from 3 to 3:45. So I'm like, man, you're really, you're working hard. So, and then she was at the Institute at 5 o'clock and is ready to go. So Jen, let's just talk a little bit about growing up in Des Moines, and particularly in the kind of the political element. I mean, your dad was a member of the city council, the school board. You tell stories that your mom was a draconian parent who required her children to wear their father's campaign shirts to school every day to help boost his candidacy for not every day, but during the campaign season. So talk a little bit about just growing up in Des Moines and particularly kind of being introduced to politics.
Yeah. I joke around, I think this would be highly illegal now, but my dad made these shirts for us that said "Vote for Bill Daulby for city council." And it was one of the, my daughter thinks I embarrass her all the time. I'm like, you got nothing on your grandma. And we would hand out little cards that would say "Vote for Bill Daulby." I still have some. They were like little bitty business cards. And we would hand them out in front of the post office in town, which seems highly illegal. And I did election law, so I feel so that was our first of my dad, when we were in 2nd grade, decided to run for city council. And he did, wild things like zoning. And there were some things he thought should be done in town. And my grandfather was city council too. And the irony that I worked on election law and I was in the Capitol on January 6th and had all this exposure to elections. My dad used to store our election equipment in our basement because that's what you did when you were a precinct committee person, right? You'd put it together. And small town, rural middle America is filled with people like that just wanted to try to do a little bit better and serve their town and their county and their state and their country. And so I grew up and we clearly had political opinions in my house, but I saw it from the viewpoint of what can you give back to your community? And I would go to city council meetings. I remember we consolidated a lot of our city resources into one building, and he would have the architectural design in his office. And then there were budget issues at the high school, and he would look at the numbers. And it was just the basics, right? So I grew up from a standpoint of the basics versus getting really tied to partisan issues. I saw it from a very local level, and I always think that benefited me in my career.
And then even in high school, you became sort of intrigued by politics. I think you had maybe a school trip to Springfield where you were able to roam on the floor of the Senate. Talk about just kind of developing your political interests through.
Yeah, we had a program at our school. My high school government teacher is here, and she and a lot of others spent their time devoted to programs like youth and government, right? And we've had kind of a resurgence in the idea that we need to double down on civics and programs like youth and government and giving students exposure, right, to what being in Congress and their state legislature looked like. And I remember how much pride we had. Me and my best friend of 4 years old, I would drag her with me. She would drag me to stuff. I would drag her to youth and government. And we passed our bills every year, and we were committee chairs. And then I got to go to the national one in North Carolina. And I remember thinking, man, like these kids are really smart and they love government and politics, and what opportunities for a small town kid to get to see their government. And so I loved it then too. And then again, that was not a partisan exercise, right? There was just a bunch of high school kids who were pretending like we were state legislators for the weekend. And then I got to be a page. I was actually a page in the state legislature, and I don't talk about it, and I don't know why, because it seemed insignificant, because my uncle lived in Springfield, and he worked for the House staff, and he let me come with him. And I rode with my state rep, who had a phone in his car at the time. I thought it was the most, sophisticated thing ever. And I worked in the state legislature in Springfield as a page. And I think all those exposures really were fundamental at that age.
And then you went to Eastern and studied political science. Did you have particular teachers who were inspiring, who were sort of propelled you forward?
Our student government at Eastern actually had a lot of power as far as student legislatures go. And I remember my political science, my pre-law advisor was like, you're wasting your time with this like student government thing. You need to be in like mock trial and stuff. And I was like, you guys are just like yelling at each other. Student Senate. We passed a referendum to improve our university. We convinced all of our fellow students to vote for it. And I had a great relationship with the president, and I worked in the vice president's office. And so I chose to spend my time being in Student Senate. And in fact, the person who beat me for the Speaker of the Student Senate is a good friend of mine, and she's coming to speak at a Congressional Management Foundation event in February. And so I think those experiences of just governing versus picking issues was just great experience.
We had our Renewing Illinois Summit about a year ago this time, and Governor Edgar spoke, and he was a graduate of Eastern, and it was president of the student council, and was regaling the students with his battles with the president of Eastern back at the time, and said that it was, that he learned some of the basic skills of, having a strong position, and then, sitting down and hearing another perspective, and trying to find a way that, both sides could agree to.
Well, the best job I had in undergrad, John, was I worked in the graduation office. And I was fortunate enough, I got chosen for Senior of the Year. And my family came, and we had this lovely reception. And the head of that would run all the graduations for Eastern, he said, I held 2 seats back for your parents because I knew you couldn't get there in time. And I gave my parents 2 tickets right before graduation, and they were sitting next to Jim Edgar because his wife went back and got his degree and actually graduated the same time I did. So we joke around, my family, that my parents sat with the Edgars at my college graduation.
Great. So then, was it at Eastern you did an internship in D.C.?
Yeah, my junior year, between my junior and senior year, I went and I was Congressman Shimkus's first intern ever. I had worked in Springfield. I joke around for one of our governors that went to jail, and I think that's a rite of passage when you're in Illinois, right? And so I went and I had an internship. I had internship at the local level in college, at like I think planning, zoning commission or something. They were lovely. And then I had this internship in Springfield at the Secretary of State's, and this guy named John Shumkas was running for Congress. And my uncle, who was very political, I had it on both sides of the family, kept nudging me, like, maybe you should go help him on the weekends. And I was like, okay. So I did, and he won, and he said, maybe you should go ask that chief of staff for a job. And he paid me as an intern in 1997 when no one was paid. And he my chief of staff walked me to work on my first day, and I had never seen the Capitol until I walked to work on my first day as an intern. So,
memorable first day on the job. So let's talk about your decision to come to SIU Law School, and what propelled you? I know you looked at other law schools and considered other options, but what was the thinking? What were you aspiring for a legal career at that point, or was it just to develop a strong foundation for whatever would come in the future?
Yeah, I was in this tough spot because I had interned in Washington, but I didn't know if D.C. was my town, right? Because for a small town kid who then had gone to school in Charleston, Illinois, of 10,000 people, to go to D.C. seemed a bit overwhelming. And so I was like, I don't know if I want to go to D.C. But then I had been spoiled, and I was like, I don't know if I want to work for the state legislature. And so maybe I should go to law school. And I knew that I probably was not going to end up at a firm. And my parents had very generously paid for my undergrad, but that was it. And I got a scholarship from Mike Bost, who was my state rep, who's now the congressman, and it paid for my entire year of SIU. And so that allowed me to go and be a legislative assistant for $30,000 out of law school. And then I started to get my student loans paid for too. So SIU was an affordable option with connections to my family and great relationships with my professors, which two of my former professors are here. And it was so fundamental to be in a space where people cared about you. And I called on many of my professors, had a lot of criminal procedure questions and constitution questions. And so it was such a lovely environment to feel like you were seen and included. And I credit so much to SIU because we had to work so hard. I think SIU law grads are so much more prepared than others because you work real hard to stay here. It's not, we joke, we were talking today, it's not Harvard, it's not pass fail. If you want to stay at Southern, at one point we weeded out a third of the freshmen, or a third of the first year class, and I don't know if those are the same numbers, but you worked hard all 3 years to be here and to stand out.
Well, when you met with students today, you told an interesting story. You had kind of a transition year where, actually, I think it was before law school, and you weren't sure what to do, but you ended up working for your sorority. To sort of your parents' astonishment, they were not quite sure that
became a pattern.
Yeah. But talk about that, because you said it was one of those kind of gap year experiences that turned to be really formative and really confidence enhancing. So let's tell that story if you would.
Yeah, I think sometimes folks get burned out of like just going right through. Some students can do it, some students can't, but I had not totally been prepared to go to law school my senior year of college, and that was okay because I was really involved in my senior year. And so all of a sudden I turned down this position in the state legislature. My parents are like, what are you going to do? Like, you literally got an offer from the Illinois State Senate. You said no. And I'm like, I think I'm going to take this sorority job. And there was an advisor that happened to be the national vice president, kind of tipped the scales. And I drove over to Indianapolis where our headquarters were. And for a year, I lived out of my suitcase. I went to a different college. Every week, I made friends, such good relationships with my fellow consultants, and I grew up, right? I went to schools where I was the only non-Jewish person in the Northeast. I went to schools on the West Coast. They took me to Mexico, one of the schools in San Diego, and it was this experience that made me grow up. I toured Syracuse Law School. I was there for a month. Our chapter needed help. I went to Florida State. I went to University of Michigan. I literally went all around the country. And for a kid that's parents didn't take tons of vacations, that was how I saw the country. And I grew up more that year than any other year. And then that was formative because when I went to law school, I studied abroad in London. And I remember my dad saying, no one in our family has gone abroad. And just call us when you get there and we'll be thinking about you and we know you'll figure it out. And so I tell students, take these incremental steps that give you exposure to people outside of your circle and outside of your comfort zone and just keep building on that.
Well, let's talk about your work on Capitol Hill, because you've had this remarkable experience. You've worked for 4 members of Congress, 2 from Illinois, and so maybe reflect on those experiences, but also, and this is the point you made to the students that I thought was really important, the kind of understanding of kind of apprenticeship and being willing to just work your way up and take your time and learn on each job and not try to be, CEO before you're 25 years old, but to just build skills, build contacts, kind of own the job, and then start looking for other opportunities. So talk a little bit about just your approach to work on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I took that same law school ethic and then I applied it in DC, and I got to cut the line a little bit my first job, and I was a legislative assistant, but it wasn't a legal position. And again, my parents are like, what are you doing? But I had 4 or 5 subject matter that I was the legislative assistant for. And I just stayed later than everybody else. And I was so used to those law school hours. And my colleagues would be like, well, you're kind of making us look bad. And I was like, well, I got to read these 4 or 5 things because there's a bill on this week, and I'm going to be the best I can possibly be. And I'm just going to soak it up. And I just kept hustling. And I think I didn't appreciate how much I moved up at a young age. I think that has probably been a blessing of not letting it sink in. I just kept working really, really hard. And I had a chief of staff and a member, and I remember getting into it with my boss in the hallway, and I said, sir, you need to vote yes on this amendment because you made this commitment on this special education issue and we're not funding it. And he was like, and he came back, he goes, I hope you're happy I voted yes. And Shimkus was he was a West Pointer, so he always had one of those rings, and he was an Army Ranger, and he was so tough, but he knew I had done my homework and I was right, and that amendment was consistent with his position. So I just tried to work harder than everybody else.
And then talk for a second about your time on the Judiciary Committee, because it was like one of these committees that is involved in so many aspects, and you took an important committee job and just received sort of an entire education almost on American governance. Yeah. Talk about that if you would.
I tell students to chase the energy, right, and who you see as being a leader. And I worked on the Agriculture Committee, and it was fine, but it was a non-farm bill year. So then I went over, I had been on a committee, and then I worked in a personal office for a subcommittee chair. So it was me overseeing 5 attorneys at the committee to make sure they always had his voice. And that chairman marked up 180 bills in 6 years, which is a wild pace for the Hill, and one that I wish they would follow now. So every Wednesday at 10 o'clock in the morning, we would mark up. And every Tuesday night, my boss, Mr. Shabbat from Ohio, would require a memo. Every single meeting he wanted a memo, and he would read it. So you knew you had to get it right, and he'd call me. I'd be at the office till 8:30, and then he'd call me, and he was such a nice man, but he was very thorough. He would say, I'm reading your memo right now, and it looks like we're going to have 4 or 5 amendments on this, and how do you think we're going to get the votes for this, or what's going to happen? And he made me a better staffer because I was so prepared. And then we would have 3 to 5 hearings a week. We did Voting Rights Act. We did Second Amendment issues. We did pro-life, pro-choice issues. We did Patriot Act issues. You name it, we did it. And what I love about Judiciary Committee is it's what separates the philosophy of the parties, right? No one's coming to lobby you about the flag burning amendment, right? Pharma's not coming, big defense isn't coming, big ag's not coming, whoever you want it to be. People don't lobby that committee. And so no one writes questions for you or meets with you. You have to know it yourself. So I think if you can cut your teeth on that committee, then you could go anywhere. And it served me later in my career because I had to get so good at amendments. And what I loved about that committee is it's the last of the true legislating. And I worked in the majority at the time, and the minority would sit like 60 amendments down like 5 minutes before the markup would start. And I would be back there and, we'd be almost breathing out of a paper bag, and I would say to the councils, you have 1 through 5, you have 5 through 10, you have 10 through 15. And I'd be like, sir, we got you. We're going to write down on the paper and just read what we write and yes or no. And it just was wild. The minority made you want it, and they made you know your bills. And there were very good legislators that came out of the committee because they had to know their bills, because they had to defend it like other committees don't.
Well, let's talk for a couple minutes about your time as chief of staff, because you were chief of staff for Rodney Davis, a really honorable member. But the chief of staff is a really difficult position in, I think, government. And I remember seeing an interview with Leon Panetta, who was the White House chief of staff, and someone said, so what is the job? He said, spear catcher. And the point being that this is the person who makes sure that the principal is well prepared, the office runs well. And I've heard you say this in interviews, sometimes have to be the one that says no. Yeah. Cannot always be the nice person. Talk about the job of a chief of staff.
It was literally my dream job. And I remember I came into the office as the folks on the Hill were getting it ready, right? And they do this huge turnover every 2 years. And I walked in, the IT guys were there, and I said, oh my gosh, thank you so much for getting our office ready. I know what a hard time of year it is. And they said, what are you? And I said, I'm the chief. He said, oh, you got the good office. And I got to go in and just have a minute. And I was like, wow, I got here. This was the job I wanted for a long time. And it was Mr. Davis and I and the kids. He told a joke about Cheers, like the sitcom Cheers. And I said, boss, only you and I are going to get that. He comes back to me. He goes, only you and I are going to get that. I go, it's you and I and the kids from here on out. And he was such a fun member, and he was so nice. And he worked really hard. But I tell chiefs all the time, I remember having this moment, and every chief has this moment, and it was about 6 months in, and I looked around, and I'm like, I'm the only person that says no. And my mom would joke around. She's like, are you like that movie Veep, that one chief just says no all the time? And I'm like, kind of. And I tell other chiefs, because my foundation writes a book about how to open a DC office. And I said, you have a choice to make. Is you can be the member's best friend, or you can tell them the things they need to know. And even to this day, I called him the other day, hey boss, I know this isn't fun information, but you need to know. And he was like, thank you so much. And we just established that relationship, that I wasn't his body person. I was not around him 24/7. But the staff was always prepared. And if he wasn't his best, I would pull him aside and say, you did not read the memo. You did not read the questions. You were not prepared. And if the staff starts to sniff that you are not prepared, they will not perform. And when you need them to perform, they won't be there. And we just established an amazing trust and respect for one another. And he took a chance on me when I had a 3-year-old daughter, and I'm 6 years younger than him, and he had the most competitive Republican district in the country when I was his chief. And so I say people like him are the model for taking chances on non-traditional chiefs, and we had a good run for 8.5 years.
And then talk for a minute or two about just being the staff director of a committee. It was the House Administration Committee, which Mr. Davis chaired, as I understand it. So how is that different than being a chief of staff, being a staff director of a committee?
Yeah, so chief, you're always about your member. I was 10 feet from his office for years, and you're the surrogate when you have to be, but you're really just always propping him up, making sure the speech is good, making sure we responded to constituents, making sure we raised the money we needed to, that, you're the boss of the lawyers and the campaign and the staff, and making sure his wife and kids were happy and all of it. And then all of a sudden you go down to the committee, and I had my own schedule every day that was different from his, because he's up in his personal office, and here I'm down here with all of this staff. And You are making decisions at a level I have never made decisions. And sometimes chiefs go on to be staff directors, and there's a concern that they don't know the subject matter, which is why being a lawyer was helpful, because my committee had jurisdiction over election law and over operations. Well, I was a chief, so I understood the operations of the House, and then I had been an attorney on Judiciary Committee, so I understood the election piece, and I could go in a room and speak for him, and we were always in lockstep because I had been with him for so long, and other staff couldn't, so that was always my secret weapon, is when we would negotiate. I had his voice, but it was very different experience to have your own agenda in your own meetings. And then, if we would screw up, we would just be one of 435 people. When you're head of a committee and you screw up, you screwed up everything for your conference because you are the subject matter expert for everybody within your party. And then you're down on the floor. And right, C-SPAN doesn't have a delay. So if you embarrass him or you're down there or you're not ready, it's a lot, right? And whether we were on rules committee or why, it is, you have to have it together or it gets real messy real quick. And so you have less leeway.
Well, then Jen also had a great career in the private sector. But let's talk about the Congressional Management Foundation. It's an institution that's been going for about a half a century, and its mission, as I understand it, is to just make Congress a stronger institution. Tell us a little bit about how it started. I mean, what was the animating idea of CMF, and how did it come to life?
Yeah. 50 years ago, there was a group of members who talked about a need to have an outside organization that helped them do their job better. And 40 years ago, there was a woman who ran for Congress and said, no one has a book about running for Congress. What if someone wrote a book about running for Congress and they updated it and it would be like a manual so people would know what they were getting into? And so then we started publishing this book called Setting Course. And Congressional Management Foundation has had a lot of different iterations, and I think that's what foundations do, right? In nonprofits, you fill the holes that are not being met, and my gosh, is there a hole in Congress to show up and teach people how to be members and staff and learn the fundamentals? Less than 50% of members in Congress have been there more than 3 terms. So I always joke around, if you want to be really knowledgeable at like your neighbor's barbecue and people say, we need term limits. It's like, no, we don't. Everybody's leaving. And the people we want to leave or want to stay are leaving and vice versa. So CMF really came from a need to have an entity that just taught the basics like retreats and goal setting and agendas and the fundamentals that I think ground really good congressional offices. And when I was chief, that was so strong to me because I'd had this private sector experience. And then I was staff director, House Administration Committee. We were like the mayor of Capitol Hill and overseeing all these different entities. And so you could see what was working and what wasn't. And we tried to do a lot of professional development programs to elevate how offices ran.
So like a new member is elected from, Illinois or wherever, and do they come to you and say, how do I start this office? I mean, there's probably some at least very, very modest institutional orientation, but do they basically, like the House Republican caucus, say, go to the CMF and get your fundamentals put in place? What happens?
Yeah. So the House has an orientation, so does the Senate. And when I was House Administration staff director, I ran orientation. I joked around, it was like being pledge educator for the biggest fraternity in the country and the most demanding. And that is more like, let's get your picture for your voting card. Let's literally pick out the carpet and the curtains. But then no one thinks about what it takes to run your office and what kind of chief of staff you want and what kind of legislator you want to be and what committees. And I had the privilege of going to Harvard. Harvard puts on a retreat every year for members. And a colleague and I spoke about mail. And I remember this member, I believe he was from California. He was from a large state. He said, well, I'm just going to have staff sign my name. I said, no, sir. Your name goes on every letter because this is your office and you now represent 700,000 people. And if that scares you, it should. And you should really think about who you hire and who is in charge of what's going on over there. And so we try to make members think about the management piece and not just the logistics piece of the office when they first get there.
And for most, politicians, management is not their training, their background, probably not their interest. So it's critical that they find and hire someone who has that sort of management competence to make sure that the trains run on time.
And we try to emphasize that too. And even if you do bring your campaign manager, maybe someone's not qualified, come to our training. And I have current and former chiefs train the new chiefs. And it really is a great bipartisan exercise. And I've had some of my staff say, I have no idea who's a Republican or a Democrat in that room. I said, it doesn't matter. It's a really hard job. It's the same issues they deal with. And if they can bond over how to do the job better and trading best practices, that's a good day. So let's just start at some fundamentals. We don't need to lock ourselves in a room and debate Medicaid. Let's just start with some fundamentals of how we send letters out, how we do goals, how we run our office every day.
Well, I want to talk about some of the awards that you give out, because you have a wonderful event that's held in the House Ways and Means Committee room, which is really one of the elegant rooms on Capitol Hill. And, I was looking at your press release for the rewards this year, in which you said, you said the ceremony is a powerful reminder that at its best, Congress is a place where collaboration, respect, and a shared commitment to public service still thrive. And then let's go through some of the awards, because you're trying to highlight some of the essential skills and kind of competences. You have an award for constituent experience or service, an award for constituent experience in Washington, one on correspondence and outreach, innovation and modernization, bipartisan engagement and collaboration. Then you have an award for excellence in congressional management. The winner of that award, Nikki Brzezinski, will be here 2 weeks from tonight, and I hope you're all here. But talk about sort of the genesis of these awards, and then what you're trying to underscore by conferring them every year.
So I always say we're the cheerleaders for Congress, and there are a lot of institutions and a lot of organizations that criticize Congress and then send them long lists and reports of what they should do, and they're really sick of hearing that, because a lot of them know what they should do. So I just try to show up and support them and make them better versions of themselves in their office. But then we have this very public-facing part, the democracy awards that we call the Oscars of Capitol Hill. I don't know if that's sticking or not, but we internally say that. And I added this year bipartisan and collaboration, because we have to give awards for the behavior we want to see. And if you're a member, and I had a staff talk to me the other day, she was interviewing to be a chief of staff. I said, okay, well, tell me about your member, and did you guys have a retreat? Do you have goals? Oh yeah, we have goals. Oh great, you're already steps ahead. Tell me your goals. Our goals are communication, fundraising, and to be in leadership. I was like, well, you're in a safe district. Why are you needing to raise money? Pause. Why does she want to be in leadership? What's her agenda? Pause. Okay, what are you doing? What is anchoring your communications? Do you have a policy? Do you have things you're doing? Pause. And so I think the democracy awards are so strong. We had 80 offices apply this year, because it says this is the metrics of what makes you an effective member of Congress. It isn't raising money. It isn't screaming at your political opponents in committee hearing rooms. It's serving your constituents when they come to DC, making sure they have a good experience and giving them a tour and helping them out and making people feel connected to their government. The gentleman that won bipartisan ship and collaboration has dinners monthly that he invites folks of the opposite party, and his wife cooks, and people don't know about it, and I knew about it, and I nudged him to apply. And it's not performative bipartisanship, it's genuine bipartisanship. And it's like Congresswoman Budzinski, she runs a really good office. And if you run a really good office, you probably have a better chance of serving your constituents and being responsive. And if you know what your constituents think, you probably vote with them more often than not, right? And so we're trying to just set some fundamentals and some goals for members.
I was a reporter for a number of years covering Capitol Hill, and the one thing, everyone talks about the good old days, but I do think that there is an element of institutional patriotism that has faded. And I was just thinking recently of an experience I had just started, and I was covering the Treasury Secretary who was coming up to Capitol Hill to testify. It was Bob Rubin. And so he's a Democratic Treasury Secretary, and he's testifying. And, sort of the typical game is the Democrats would give their administration official a pass, and the Republicans would be hard on him. But this was a hearing in which everyone was just trying to figure out what was going on. And I have a very vivid memory of a young congresswoman from California, and this dates me, who was a relatively new member of the House Appropriations Committee, pressing Rubin really, really hard on some aspects of the Treasury budget, and that was Nancy Pelosi.
Appropriator. Mm-hmm.
And it just occurred to me that, she viewed her job as being part of an oversight initiative of the executive branch. That was her job. And the fact that it was a Democratic administration, she was aware of, but that was not the guiding premise behind her testimony. Talk about the notion of institutional patriotism and how that, has faded and what can be done to restore it.
Yeah. I think it's a frame of mind, too. We would always say in our office, Mr. Davis is the ambassador for the 13th District of Illinois, right? And if you think of yourself like that, then you present as that, right? You're not here to get 1,000 likes on X or make Fox News or MSNBC. You're here to represent your constituents. And so I would say you're a happy warrior. You're the CEO of your district, and you're the ambassador to the 13th District of Illinois. And everything was framed for those three things. And I think members who are very grounded and know who they are, like the former speaker, it's really strong. And then I always say to staff, you're not going to have this got you moment. How many times have we seen members trying to have this got you moment and embarrass themselves? I'm like, it's not going to happen. You can't do the back and forth in 5 minutes. And so be the member that knows more than everybody else at the hearing. And then also, too, I remember we were doing this huge speech before the Bipartisan Policy Center on elections. And the whole speech, 3 pages, was blaming the other party. And I said, absolutely not. The CEO of the Illinois 13th District never blames other people, right? Could you imagine being a CEO for a company, publicly traded company, and you go before your stockholders and your investors, and you just complain about all the things of why your company didn't perform or what's going on? And I tried really hard we talk about what we're for. Talk about what you're for in your office. Talk about the vision for America that you have and the policies that you want to see, and be subject matter experts and know that. Now, I can't help it because I am a loyalist to the institution. Part of why the first branch is not going well is because the second branch blocked them from their job. And we saw it a little bit during Bush in Afghanistan. We saw it more during Obama. We saw it more during Trump. We saw it more during Biden. We're seeing it now. And so if an agency makes it really hard for you to do oversight and blocks you from finding out information, then all of a sudden you get to really low value questions. And I tell folks, how did we get here? We got here with a lack of respect of the 2 branches, and we have to go back to vigorous oversight. And agencies that have traditionally not allowed for oversight have eventually not done well. And it's good for everybody if we are open about the process. And when cabinet secretaries come, they are knowledgeable and they are open and they respect Congress, and Congress respects them and their position and doesn't try to get a soundbite. So it's almost like we need to de-escalate both branches too.
There was a podcast the New York Times had a couple weeks ago, and the headline, I read the transcript, and the headline was, "Congress is dying in real time." And it was just, it was certainly playing on the shutdown and the fact that, the House had gone out of session, and it was just, it seemed to be a clear illustration of an institution that had, was just heading steadily in the wrong direction. Do you think that overstates it? And what are the kind of practical steps that could happen in the next, 2, 4, 6 years to just reverse the descent and just start, building a stronger institution? And then I'm going to turn to you for questions in a sec.
Yeah, I think we adopted some really poor policies that were not the intention, right? I think it's Madison or one of the founding fathers said there will not always be statesmen at the helm. And so how do you have an institution where that's the case? And I tell people all the time, if we were in Europe, we would have a coalition government, right? Because the numbers are so close. A congresswoman that I have a lot of respect for had a baby in August, and she was so upset. She's like, Jen, everyone cares about my due date. I got a bunch of men that are all over me about when this baby is due. And I'm like, oh, how terrible that your vote is so needed, that we're now putting pressure on your due date. And I say all the time to staff, tight majorities doesn't mean you stay home for 7 weeks. Tight majorities is when you find consensus and go to the other aisle. It doesn't mean you tighten it up and you don't come here and you make it get really ugly. Like, no one in tight majorities demand bipartisanship because the American people are not giving one party a clear majority. And one of my favorite statements by John Boehner, he would always say, if I don't have 218, I'm a man on the walk. I'm not the Speaker of the House. And he used to let votes go where he didn't have 218. And I see a lot of instances when we have a majority of members align on an issue, but that bill will not come to the floor because we made stupid rules that you have to have the majority of the majority. And I think this week is another example. We need to fund the government, full stop. And when that bill comes back from the Senate, both parties need to think very, very hard at the pain they're willing to inflict on the American people for a subject that is very important, but that has nothing to do with funding the government. And we could talk for another hour about strategy and how that works, but I'm very concerned that we're viewing tight majorities as an opportunity to not legislate. It just means you legislate a little differently, and the Senate's been doing it for a long time, and the House needs to do it right now too.
I know one of the lines you make when you give talks is that we don't have the government we deserve. We have the government we elect.
Yeah, a Thomas Jefferson version. It's a version of a Thomas Jefferson quote. Yeah, I say that all the time. You get the government you elect, not the government you deserve. So if you don't like the government you have, you should go elect a different one.
Great. Well, let's open it up for questions about Jen. Anything pertaining to her career, her current experiences on Capitol Hill, growing up in Des Moines, campaigning for her dad for city council, whatever.
Illegally at the post office.
Jen, what do you call on the audience?
Sure. Hi, Jen. Thank you for being here. My name is Anu Ngwa, and I'm a 1L at Simmons Law. My question is, what advice would you give to someone who is interested in pursuing a career in politics?
Well, first, I think it's an honorable career, and I encourage people all the time to go work in politics. And I don't care what side of the aisle, and if you don't know what side of the aisle you want to be on, that's okay too. Just intern, work on a campaign, start at the lowest level, answer the phones, do whatever it takes. Just show up. And the first job might not be the job that you love, and that's okay. And that's like our conversation about it being kind of an apprenticeship. Like, just go learn the institution, whatever way you can get in. Just go learn it and then pivot from there. But if you have any interest, lean in and don't give out and figure out a way. And I remember when I left law school, it was so uneasy. I wanted to be a state's attorney, and then I wanted to work in a state's attorney's office, and I ended up going to Congress. And I tell people all the time, if you think you're going to get an offer from a government entity like 6 months before your graduation rate, you're not. You just have to say, I'm going to go do it, period. And I'm going to make it happen. And don't let folks convince you otherwise, because there's going to be a million jobs that are going to give you more certainty than a career in public service. But you won't regret the time you did it. And if you don't like it, you can pivot. But it's better to do it earlier in your career.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you very much. My name is Tatiana Castillo. I'm the intersocial work at the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. And I had the opportunity to be in the lounge with Jen, and we talked about something that I think is very interesting and important to share as well with the people who is here now. So I'm going to bring again the question to you, especially because as we see in the auditorium, we have a few young women interested in this type of conversations. So my question is, when we became very excited with political beliefs, strong or deep political beliefs, how can we balance that situation with the need for a collaborative work in making policy?
Yeah, like how do we balance policy with strong political beliefs? We would have these chief of staff meetings every week, and a few of us would bond together that were in really tough seats, and we'd be like, you are going to cost us this majority. These stupid votes were taken, and we would push back against leadership all the time. And I remember I said one time to one of my colleagues, you think you're more conservative than my boss. You just have the luxury of voting no and hoping that we get to yes, and not having to go explain your vote back home because your district is so safe. And I say all the time, bipartisanship does not occur just in the center right and center left. It's a choice as a member to find commonality on the other side of the aisle. And you can always find commonality if you want to look for it. And so I think being open to compromise and viewing people as not political enemies. We have different views of how our country should work. It doesn't mean anyone's views are less than someone else's. It just means they have a different view. And if we talk long enough, we're going to find that we have similar views on something. So I say all the time to members, go find someone that agrees with something. And there's a lot of issues that aren't political, right? Trains, airplanes, agriculture. There's so many issues that are not that political. And there's some that are, but there are more issues that are not political than are. And I say all the time to the minority party, are you the opposition party? Or are you a party that has a different idea? Because know what your party stands for. Because if not, you wake up and you're the opposition party. And that's what I would say to my friends in the House, to vote no against the government reopening. Do you really not want the government to reopen? And do you really disagree with the level of appropriations funding? Or are you just the minority party? Because just being the minority party is pretty dangerous sometimes.
Jen, I will say also you had once made the point that in terms of even individual careers, you encourage students to know what they are for as opposed to just becoming skilled in playing defense. That it's important to be kind of a positive force for laying out a perspective. I mean, could you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah. I say this to staff all the time, too. I think particularly now, know what you are for and what your line is, because you could go work with a member that is pushing your line and what you're about. And you do work in service almost always, unless your name's on the door and that you're an elected official. And so there are going to be times where that tests you, but know what you're for and what you want to deliver for the American people. And I've said that to a lot of staff. And I had dinner with one of them last week, and she said, I'm getting close to my line. I said, then it's time to leave, right? Because you need to know what you're for. And if you give your talents to someone that's pushing that line, then that's probably not a great place. And if you don't have, I've seen staff too, some of my staff. I've seen one staff member who I adore, and he loves the bright and shiny things. And he is in that big White House in the middle of the city right now. And I don't think he has a line. I think there's a ton of people that work in the administration that are great people that are doing a good job. And this one particular staffer, I'm not convinced that he has the line. It's like, did you wake up every day and it was bright and shiny and it was fun? Or did you work in service of the American people and in something bigger than yourself? Or did you just go and have a good time at the parties?
Have you had, in your career, I mean, you talk about the line, moments when it was very clear to you that by agreeing to this or doing this action, that you would be crossing kind of a personal boundary that you just could not?
I would say it was the opposite. I knew at times I was supporting my boss and crossing a line that our party probably didn't like, right? There are 4 members that certified the election in the House, and Mr. Davis was one of them, and he paid a political price later in his career. But it was like, right, on January 6th, we were having proceedings to certify the election in the Electoral College. And then we had to take a break because a few people tried to break in. And then we went back. And the Senate could feel that it had changed. And they backed off. What they were doing is like, wait a minute, let me read the room here. We got to certify the election and go home and be united. And there's a lot of people that are confused about what's happening. And I remember my boss, and I was like, whew. We got to certify this thing and get out of here and swear in this next president. And Mike Pence was there, and he was on board with all of it too. And I think there were some members that thought they should keep fighting. And our committee, who had jurisdiction over election issues, were saying the unpopular thing and saying to members too, like, do you realize what you're voting on if you're objecting? The role of Congress is so that on the Electoral College is so that American people are physically seeing you take the ballots out and certify them, because we are an open democracy. You should not be weighing in of a state that has a legal election certificate and deciding among yourselves that that election certificate isn't valid. I mean, that just completely unwinds the rule of law. And there's not been a legal case that has been won to make us question any of the election certificates. So I would probably say the opposite, John, of like leaning in at times when it has been unpopular and hard.
So how did, with Rodney Davis, who had this wonderful, honorable career, he was defeated in a primary. I don't mean to be too personal, but as best you can determine, does he look back and said, I'm really proud of the service I rendered, and I'll move forward with my life, but it's been a win as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I don't think he has any regrets. He's head of the government affairs for the entire U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And so he's gone on to do something even bigger than he was doing before, and has a huge impact, represented businesses across the country. And our team was very proud of who he was and the way he ran his race. And I think the only people that got the short end of that stick was the constituents, because really good members will go on and do other things and they'll be just fine. And at times, who gets left behind are the constituents that deserved that type of member of Congress. And I think about that all the time. And that's why we give awards for Chief of Staff of the Year at the Democracy Awards. We used to give Lifetime Achievement Awards. And I'm like, we're not giving you an award because you're leaving early. I'm giving you awards because you're staying in the game and you're going to continue to serve. So, yeah, I think he was very happy with the service. Roy Blunt was the other Republican member who certified the election, who was a senator from Missouri, and I think they were both at peace with the role they played and the positive contributions they made to the country. I think Mike Pence would say the same thing.
Other questions?
Yes, mine's a twofold question. Where do you see the government in 5 years, and where do you see yourself in 5 years?
That one's easy for myself. I hope I'm still at the Congressional Management Foundation, and I hope we are making it rain and that people appreciate what we're doing, because this year I started a bipartisan chief of staff retreat, taking 30 chiefs to University of North Carolina, who's agreed to host us. They have an amazing school of government, amazing dean that I've become friends with. And I said, this is a leadership retreat. It's not a political trip. We're not going fancy places. We're going to go learn how to be leaders and get to know each other and have those relationships. And I made a lot of relationships with chiefs. I got to travel around the world in this job: China, Japan, Germany, the UK, Canada, oh gosh, I know I miss Africa, you name it, and make friends with chiefs. So I want to keep doing what I'm doing at the Congressional Management Foundation for a long time and continue to figure out how we find bipartisan spaces for staff and members. For Congress, people always ask, have we hit the bottom? And I hope we have hit the bottom. I've started to see some members reject what I consider a really negative discourse. I think you have to look really, really closely because I'm not seeing a ton of it. I'm seeing some generational turnover in how we have younger members. We had a debate about proxy voting in 2025 for the first time because we had so many women having children that we had to figure out a way for them to vote. So I see the institution moving that way, and I hope we hit the bottom real soon of rejecting the current metrics. I also am optimistic because I think election and campaign finance reform are so, so important. And so Alaska had ranked choice voting. I see more and more pressure and questioning the system and saying, how can we think about campaign finance? Do we really want this much money and this much time and energy put into campaigns? Do we want to figure out how we have more competitive primaries? I met someone from Tennessee the other day, a very red state, who said, my mission is how do I get more people to vote in primaries and how do I get more moderate candidates? And so I've just seen, being in this position, I'm optimistic of all the groups I'm seeing that are questioning that. And I hope that's positive, and I hope people embrace it too, because we have very few people voting in primaries that are deciding elections, and we've got to change that dynamic. And I think when we change that dynamic, we'll change behavior.
Thank you. Good evening, and I am just delighted to have you here on campus tonight. I have the pleasure of being very close friends, as we talked earlier, of your aunt, Reagan Robbins Atwood. Reagan and I were actually interns together, and we are still very close friends. And one of the things that I'd like to know from you is, what do you think we need to do to inspire that next generation of young women? We have a group of young women that are involved with the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. They formed a group of young women that are interested in public service, public policy, and civic engagement. And what kinds of things do you think we should be doing as an institution to inspire that next generation of young women?
There's a group I really love right now. It's called the Policy Circle. And they were a group of women in the North Shore of Chicago who were sitting and having coffee and decided they wanted to talk about more things than just their kids' school. And I went to their conference for the first time, and they have these things called policy circles all around the country. They don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, whoever you are, it doesn't matter. But they decided that women needed to start talking about public policy issues, and their materials are fabulous. The president's like, can you look over them? And I'm like, these are amazing. Just like 1 and 2 pagers about things like cryptocurrency, AI, you name it. And the idea is like, how do we just get back to talking in a civil way about policy issues? And from that, they're starting to build a pipeline of women who are running for office. And I love to see that. When I was chief, there were very few female chiefs. I was the only mom that was head of a committee at the time. And I am just seeing so many more. We've tried to normalize being a parent and being a chief of staff and a staff director. I think it's so important. And I think our members have become so much more acceptant that it's okay to have a family. And I hope that inspires women, and particularly who have felt like it was a lot of what we saw at law firms, right? You were fine until you had kids. And then when you had kids, you couldn't be a partner, you had to leave. And now I think we're seeing that in more examples. What I think is preventing people from serving is this ick that surrounds advocacy campaigns that I see, right? So like AARP's emailing you, telling you to call your congressman, or you've seen it on Facebook or what have you. You know who you're yelling at? My daughter, who was an intern this summer and who was 17 and got yelled at all summer long about the Epstein files because she worked for a vulnerable moderate member and his district was targeted. So I say, like, One, try not consume emotionally driven news, and try not to make emotionally driven actions because an outside group and both parties are offenders in both sides, because all that is doing is making people have a really bad experience who work for our government. And it's okay to communicate with your elected official, we should, and it's okay to engage. And right, this country had a ton of very peaceful protests several weeks ago, but if you were calling and screaming at your member of Congress and you think that's going to accomplish something, all you did is make that young person not want to work for our government. And so I'm really questioning those tactics. And we're just making a lot of consultants rich that do advocacy campaigns. And I'd like to stop that trend.
In terms of, it seems like polite discourse has been tossed out. Just in public, name calling, just rudeness. Is that, am I just seeing that now, or has that always been an issue? And I don't know if there's anything we can do about that. Is that?
I think we always joke around, I shouldn't say joke around. There's been a lot of commentary around that people started believing what we said, right? 10,000 of those people showed up on January 6th. They started believing the stuff we said, okay? And they started believing the institution was as bad as we told them it was, even though it really wasn't. So I think there was a phase where you saw members would scream at each other and they'd go in the back and be like, hey, I really don't feel like that. It's just the cameras and my constituents. But then that continued, and then everybody saw that. And that's really happening now. And they really feel that way. And I talk a lot about agency over person and how we can talk to members and start a movement that I'm going to act a certain way. I'm not going to yell at people in committee. I'm not going to scream at them on the floor. I'm not going to show bad manners at this State of the Union address, because what was very performative is now becoming very real. And I think it's a lot more real. I think people thought it was real for a long time because we were playing to our audience. And I think it is becoming more real now. And I hope that we've hit the bottom soon.
My name is Amari. As a student who is going into social work, public advocacy, how do you deal with people who are in power who, like you said, cut corners or ignore the huge responsibility that they have being in office? How do you deal with the frustration in seeing that and trying to reason with them, but maybe they know what they're doing or they want to ignore what they're doing and just keep moving ahead? How do you deal with that frustration?
Yeah, I'm really frustrated of members of Congress that aren't responsive to their constituents, because it just feels like such a baseline, right? And I speak to groups a lot, and they'll say, well, what do we do if our member of Congress won't take our meeting or be responsive? And I used to say, like, we're just going to show bad manners and we're going to play the long game and you're going to build relationships. And I think I have a different message now. And I say, well, maybe we go back home and we tell our friends and neighbors, because maybe we have an obligation as American citizens to share the experience we've had, that someone didn't, return our phone call or letter. I mean, my boss would yell at me, be like, I was in the grocery store and so-and-so said we didn't get a letter back. I'm like, yes, they did. September 6th at 3:00, their letter was sent. They didn't check their email. But I think there are some members who are not being responsive. And I think, how can we call that out in primaries? And how can we call that out in general? And how can the American people say, my metric is I don't want to hear that you're not taking meetings and that you are not representing our district. I don't care that I liked what you screamed at in committee. I might have loved what you had to say, but I care more that you didn't take someone's meeting and return their phone call. And that's the metric I'm going to judge you by at the election box.
Maybe one other final question right up here.
Yes, my question is with both sides of the aisle. You're talking about institutional patriotism, and with both sides of the aisle, from the current Republicans and then the Democratic Socialists, there seems to be a less and less faith towards institutions in general. Is there a way to boost everyone's faith in institutions or encourage institutional patriotism?
Yeah, I think we need to do some basic things. I think we need to pass the Stock Act. I don't think members should be trading stocks. And I think that we need to just quit rewarding going after our political enemies too. That's extremely concerning in a democracy. And I think we just need to become higher educated voters, right? The smarter we are about our elected officials, the less the sensational 30-second ad penetrates the last week before the election. So I don't have all the answers, but that's a few of them.
Jen, I wonder if maybe you would close with the story you told about Rodney Davis and his Lincoln speech. Tell that story.
Yeah, I remember House administration was always on the floor for every just like nuts and bolts issue. People would be like, "You're on the floor again." I was like, "Yes," because we had this bill that, wasn't monumental, but we just had so much jurisdiction over the institution. And we would talk about all the time how he represented the Lincoln District. And we would have a fight with Congressman LaHood. He'd be like, "I have the home." And Mr. Davis would say, "I have the body." And that's what matters. And so we claimed the Lincoln District because we had the body, we said. We said that all the time. We were doubling down, right? That's so classic Congress, right? You had two members claiming they were the Lincoln District, but we really thought we were. And we had an issue about removing Confederate statutes from the Capitol. And each state gets to send statutes of who they want to the Capitol. And Mitch Landrieu has probably the best podcast I've ever heard when he was mayor of New Orleans about statutes. And it was a huge issue in his city. And right, there was a big issue between the autonomy of the states to put their own statutes. But then we had to think about how those statutes were making people feel. And is there a moment of bipartisanship, right? Was there a moment of bipartisanship that we could have? And we wrote this amazing speech, and the Democrats didn't know what we were going to do. And leadership didn't know whether to weigh in or not, and it was tricky. And I was like, "Okay, boss, we're going to roll with it. You are the Lincoln District, and we're going to act like it, and you're from Illinois." And so if leadership doesn't have a position, we're going to take one and force the caucus on him. He said, "I'm with you." And the Democrats get up and give their speech, and they're expecting him to take the bait. And I said, "We're not taking the bait. We're lowering the temperature." And he stands up and he said, "I am from the Lincoln District, and a house divided will not stand. And I will be with my Democratic counterparts. And if you want to remove the statutes, I will be with you to remove the statutes." Now, what I didn't tell John is that you can't hide things on C-SPAN. And there were a bunch of members from the South that were mad about that, and they came marching down. And he said, "We got to hold the vote, we got to hold the vote." I said, "We're holding the vote, we're holding the vote." And we were whipping like crazy, and he won. And he won because he didn't want to have, the winning was that we didn't have a political fight that made the news that day. And that would have been the news of that day versus other issues that were happening. And so it just shows, like, if you can find moments of bipartisanship, take it. You don't always have to be right or figure out like this nuanced position of states' rights. And there were legitimate reasons for letting states pick their statute, but it just felt like a moment to lower the temperature and find bipartisanship and make friends. And it was one of his best floor speeches. So.
Right. Well, Jen, thank you so much for, first of all, coming back home and having such a great day at SIU, for your continuing great work for the Congressional Management Foundation. And I would urge people to go on the website and just poke around. I mean, they have a guide called Setting Course, which just explains, how to create a congressional office. And it's kind of interesting. It is interesting. And other just great materials. And plus the Democracy Awards that just underscore the people who are trying to make the institution better and solving problems. So Your foundation is doing really important work, and I hope you stay there for a long time and do all that you can to build and strengthen the institution. So thank you so much.
Thanks for the privilege of getting to come back home and seeing so many amazing people. So,
Great. Thank you again, everyone.